Hello everyone. This essay will be sort of a unique one in that not only is it reworked from an old essay I wrote for a university class I was in, it's also a reworked version of a previous video I made years and years ago. Videos about interests like these are a break on this channel where I can talk about a positive interest I have in a way that I find constructive, so I do hope you'll enjoy it. For the purposes of this essay, the three films, Blade, Blade 2, and Blade Trinity, in which the titular hero is portrayed by the stalwart Wesley Snipes, will primarily be used in reference to this character, but we would be remiss not to reference the character's comic book origins for a few key insights. The first of these is naturally his origin story. Blade was born to a sex worker when the film's first antagonist, Deacon Frost, attacked and bit her. Her fellow workers stopped him from killing the child, but his vampire bite had unintended consequences. The creation of a new hero, immune to all effects from vampirism save its longevity, the strength and speed it grants, and the thirst for blood. A young Blade teams up with a vampire hunter, and through rigorous training and furious effort earns his name Blade, one that all vampires come to fear. For a character like Blade to ever achieve any fusion of both cultural relevancy and artistic integrity, he requires an element of both borrowing and building. That is to say, Blade succeeds in much the same way that so many comparable and incomparable works, both of minor renown and within the canon, succeed, which is by receiving some cultural legacy and pressing it forward by increasing its relevancy to current events, and thus giving it a foothold in modernity that can be rescued into the future. Just as Blade as a character draws on older characters such as Van Helsing, newer characters may in fact draw on Blade first and Van Helsing second. Even where cultural concepts of either character are concerned, it's not unreasonable to say that some child somewhere might see the film Blade 2, directed by the monstrously talented Guillermo del Toro, and then and there receive inspiration for a work of literature they may write some 20 years down the road. They might never see any film starring Van Helsing at all, or they might only see it after Blade, thus setting Blade before Van Helsing in their mental landscape of the vampire hunter. Blade as a character would then be the first to shape their concept of the vampire hunter, and so despite the fact that Van Helsing came long before Blade, it would be Blade that set the precedent for Van Helsing's entrance into the theater of this hypothetical impressionable child. This is all significant for one singular reason. The English philosopher John of Salisbury famously said, as has been paraphrased by such reputable persons as Isaac Newton himself, that, quote, Bernard of Chartres used to say that we, the moderns, are like dwarves perched on the shoulders of giants, the ancients, and thus we are able to see more and farther than the latter. And this is not at all because of the acuteness of our sight or the stature of our body, but because we are carried aloft and elevated by the magnitude of the giants. Artists participate in their exchange of ideas in much the same way. Cultural concepts are built upon and expanded by the proliferation of old ideas and new twists, and these are further complicated with the fusion of different twisted ideas into larger narratives. Imagine that you are creating a painting and are allowed to select all shades and tints and ranges of colors. A practice painter mixes paints to achieve the right lean towards what they want to depict, for the world itself is not painted singularly out of 7 isolated colors. But they must also maintain the identity of the color they desire, lest they paint a canvas of overly mixed blackened paints. Even in this way, the characters born of other characters place their feet firmly before those of their forebears. The task of our ancestors, even those recent fathers of modern movements, in their art, are the legacy to which we inevitably contribute, and we therefore have a vital responsibility to build upon that legacy in a way that honors our ancestors and serves our descendants. All this is to simply drive home the relevancy of seemingly so little a thing as the race or weapon of choice of our protagonist Blade. In the coming paragraphs, or moments, these features and more will be cited as both adherences to convention and deviances from a norm, and this, without a doubt, on either part, they have indeed been. The Wandering Blade, especially as depicted in the course of Blade and the opening of Blade 2, exists as a modern superhuman equivalent of the Japanese Edo period's Ronin. These Ronin were wandering samurai. Ronin is literally Japanese for masterless samurai, and is a title that signals a warrior of the samurai code who served no feudal lord, as was common in that age, compared to others at least. Akin to the primary character of 2 of Japanese director Akira Kurosawa's films, Yojimbo and Sanjuro. Both films bear titles that reference the alias of the character who, in dialogue with other characters in the films, prefers not to share his rightful name. Of Sanjuro in particular, later says, with regards to Blade, like many contemporary action men, Blade owes much to the Western hero. He is Shane, Ethan Edwards, Hawkeye, Henry Callahan, Sanjuro, and Shaft. End quote. More on the Western element of Blade's heroism later. For the comparison to Sanjuro, later referring to Mifune's portrayal of the Ronin who uses the alias in the title, presumably, speaks to quite the non-Western understanding of such a hero. In one scene of Blade 2, Blade meditates before his mounted katana in a room whose aesthetic wall hangings bring a sense of Japanese influence to an otherwise Western portrayal of a black man resting in a city hideout. Later argues these parallels, saying, quote, "I have mentioned that Blade recalls Sanjuro, a Western hero so liminal he is neither a gunslinger nor a character from the Old West. The abstractly named hero of Akira Kurosawa's film Yojimbo, 1961, Sanjuro is a samurai who rescues a community by ending a schism between two violent groups overrunning their village. J.L. Anderson notes that here Kurosawa clearly acknowledges his interest in Westerns while maintaining perfect Japanese authenticity in his work." End quote. This is not, however, out of step with the portrayal of Blade as a black Western man wielding a sword with superhuman strength. So on the nose is this construction of Blade's namesake that it fits perfect with the music of its day. Hip-hop rappers of the 90s had no shortage of references to Eastern martial arts as metaphor for their modern mentality and physical strength with which they responded, at least in lyric, to the oppression weighing heavily on their communities. This 90s movement was, in broader strokes, often called the East Coast Renaissance of rap, but perhaps one of the best examples of the Eastern influence on black culture from this time comes with the album from this era by the group known as the Wu-Tang Clan, called Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. The album title is a clear reference to the 1978 martial arts film The 36th Chamber of Shaolin, and contains many tracks that reference Eastern martial arts films. This lyrical twist was a consistent flavor of the group during their run, and is an example of the flourishing of Eastern cultural ideas within Black American communities. Just as artistic expression of the systemic suffering of the Black community can be read as rebellion against white supremacy, the character of Blade rebels against vampires, who are generally white and therefore can be seen, in some views, as the vampire hunter of a new age instituting a racial rebellion against the Anglophilic and Eurocentric classical concept of the vampire, white, charming, and unabashedly sexual. Blade shatters this concept with his skin as much as his sword. In each of Kurosawa's aforementioned films, his matchless Ronin, portrayed by Toshiro Mifune, moves into new settlements, meets new characters, and solves new problems using his wits and sword in equal measure. If this narrative sounds familiar, it should. Just as the Western film The Magnificent Seven was a tribute to Seven Samurai, Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars is similarly a tribute to Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo. Both films and their legacy series, involving their title characters, portray a solitary, wandering warrior akin to Blade, and though Blade teams up with different characters for different junctions of his journey, in the end, the only consistent member of his team is himself. This parallel to the genre of Western films completes the earlier later quote, which continues, quote, "The frontier of the Old West, the line between civilization and savagery, is redrawn between humans and vampires. The Western hero, characteristically a gunslinger with remarkable talent for killing, fights violence with violence on behalf of the civilized community. His own affinity for the forces of darkness, the source of his skill, continually pushes him to the margins of the civilization he champions. The Western hero is a troubling, ambivalent figure, but nonetheless a fundamental pillar of American mythology. Blade draws on generations of Westerns to foreground the hybrid nature of the gunslinger." End quote. While later goes on to admit the finer details of the narrative of the Blade films don't fit exactly with the typical conventions of Western films as a genre, even the recognition of those basic similarities returns to the earlier discussed borrowing and building done by artists of conscience. In terms of the narratives of Blade and Westerns, we can see an agreement with some of later's points and Christopher Frayling's words on an iconic portion of the genre. Quote, "Apart from everything else, the man with no name seems to be operating as a completely marginal figure vis-a-vis the various social groups he encounters. Each of the films in the Dollars trilogy shows him on some kind of journey, but it starts and ends nowhere." End quote. Compelling contrasting commentaries of a black man wielding a katana in the modern urban environment flow through and past this Western construction. The writers and directors of the different Blade films construct a character who is as much Western as he is Eastern, who fundamentally exists within an urban environment that mirrors the Old West as much as it draws on Edo Japan. Later also mentions the important parallel of the vampires to Native Americans, as they are portrayed in more archaic Westerns. However, this comparison may more accurately be seen in the frontier bandits and gangsters, at least where Kurosawa and Leone are both concerned. Certainly it is a conscientious commentary to construct a black warrior lashing out against symbols of Eurocentric concepts of beauty after decades of anti-Native and anti-Mexican commentaries plagued Western films, for the bandits and gangsters are too often Mexican characters who are themselves too often portrayed by white men, while the saviors are too often white men themselves. In this matter, the Blade franchise embodies a kind of perfect evolution of those stories that featured the Ronin or the Man with No Name. To continue Frayling's analysis of the Dollars trilogy, he writes that, quote, "The Man with No Name has been consistently misinterpreted by critics as a brutal existentialist living in a moral vacuum. It's a bold claim, though not an unevidenced one. There's plenty of moral elements in Leone's films, and while some critics might find them to contain elements of moral grayness, they would perhaps be less disappointed on that scale with the Blade films, technically a trilogy as well, as those films present their morality in Blade's treatment of his foes. Neither Deacon Frost, nor Nomak, nor Reinhardt, nor Damaskinos, nor Dracula himself were exempt from Blade's hunt, his one form of justice against vampires who, without debate, pose a great threat to all of humanity. Many of Blade's foes give speeches where they declare that humans are cattle, worth only what nourishment their blood provides. Blade's characteristic response to these speeches is abrupt and ruthless execution, not necessarily because he treats people in general in this brutal way, but because he values real people and views vampires as antithetical to humans. Just as the Man with No Name or the Ronin each once kindly saved a woman and her family out of nothing more than kindness, Blade does similar things for humans he meets along the way, despite cutting a similarly imposing figure. He not only resents vampires at a personal level, he further understands that they play a detrimental role in all of human society. It's a quick and clean response to police brutality and its role in the oppression of Blade, who acts, violently it's true, out of a necessity to answer not just injustice, but also practical threats to the safety of his mother's race in all circumstances. As an aside, much more could be said on Blade and injustice. At one point in the first film, a group of police officers fire their guns at Blade without virtually any provocation, and after being shot at repeatedly, he returns fire, likely to dissuade them as he shows little interest in them after, and takes few to no human lives in the course of that extremely dangerous altercation. After being shot in the chest multiple times to no avail, his simple response is, "Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?" At which point the officers retreat. The exchange and the subsequent scenes where officers of the law show disproportionate aggression towards Blade, and a single imposter policeman is used as a pawn to try to capture Blade, are quick and subtle responses within the larger narrative to police brutality. Subtle not for their violence and obvious black and white opposing forces, but in spite of those factors. The subtlety of their nature comes out of their service to the narrative. Essentially, the cops firing at Blade give him a reason to run away with his injured companion, moving the plot forward with a direct, strong, and even humorous flair. Similar to the class commentary contained within the interactions with the police in the first film, Blade 2 uses similar visual language of class, those being the jackboots working for Damaskinos and the wealth and excess of Damaskinos and his vampire brood themselves. The vampire is not merely the vehicle for a cinematic play on race, sex, and class injustices incidentally, it itself as a concept contains them. As far as morality in the narrative is concerned, Blade is more cut and dry than some of his counterparts. The Ronin and the Man with No Name both pick fights with humans, and in the case of the Man with No Name seem to treat the lives of those humans specifically with an occasional, casual disdain. This is a move Blade resists. In her words on Aragorn as an American superhero, Janet Croft cites John Shelton Lawrence and Robert Jewett in their words in The Myth of the American Superhero when she says, quote, "Note that in the latter version, the hero is already separate from his community when the journey begins, either because he originates from outside or is an idealistic loner within but not of the community. Quote, his motivation is a selfless zeal for justice. He seeks nothing for himself and withstands all temptations. He renounces sexual fulfillment for the duration of the mission, and the purity of his motivations ensures his moral infallibility in judging persons and situations." End quote. Lawrence and Jewett 47. His victory, however, brings no guarantee of return or of acceptance by the community. End quote. With some slight deviation, a distant community could become a lack of community, and this transitions from Aragorn into Blade quite well. Croft makes this distinction purposefully, and her likely intention is to set up a series of pathways to slip Aragorn into this mythology. Blade, the Ronin, and the Man with No Name are certainly loners like Aragorn, but just as they all have their own personality quirks that differentiate them from him, he also has a pathway in his story that separates him from them. Aragorn of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings has a kingdom to rule. He has a laid-out destiny, a triumph to achieve in spite of a difficult but not unachievable goal. This distinguishes him from the other three, who have goals but no final pathway. Frayling said that the Man with No Name's journey starts and ends nowhere, and that works well in a physical interpretation as well as a more abstract sense of the character's desires. In these ways, Aragorn is unlike the other three, but what we can glean from him and from this myth of the American superhero is the importance of a morally grounded reaction, even if the reaction itself utilizes violence, in the defense of a community, orchestrated by a stranger for the good of that community to the American landscape. This is fundamentally a series of American connections. Just as a line drawn between Japan and the United Kingdom might move past the United States of America geographically, the Western concepts of a hero borrowed and exchanged between England and America are the same concepts being borrowed back and forth between Kurosawa and Leone, who brings his own Italian flair. All these intersections take place either ideologically or literally on American soil. Aragorn might be the loosest fit into the paradigm of powerful and necessary Western-Eastern qualities, but in his own post-medieval way, he might be one of the most important cultural influences. Why is Aragorn so essential to our understanding? The most succinct answer is that not only is Aragorn a sword-wielding stranger facing off against quasi-supernatural monstrous forces a la Blade, but he's also every bit as iconically Western as Kurosawa's Ronin is iconically Eastern. In light of this, his differences from the bunch are tolerable for the purposes of such a commentary. After all, one might have similar words regarding Kurosawa's Ronin, who is generally one to use violence as a last resort, a feature that was changed in the Western interpretation, a fistful of dollars. Blade likewise has little concern for the sanctity of the lives of the vampires he kills, even joking and smiling his way through some of the briefer fights. This is all glossing over something pretty critical in Croft's analysis of Aragorn, as that American superhero myth, the aforementioned renouncement of sexual fulfillment. Considering that Blade 2 at least does have an implied romantic tension between Blade and one of the other characters, this would appear to be something of a snag. He does, after all, allow her to drink his blood to save her life, an act that under certain views of vampirism is a decidedly sexual one. Blade consents to it. The short answer, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it. The longer answer, it's very important, and here's how we're going to worry about it. In her words contrasting Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Twilight so as to reveal at least one progressive element in Stephenie Meyer's series, Rhonda Nicol writes, quote, "Bella and Buffy manifest the belief that sex and love ideally should go hand in hand, and they believe this not only because they are good girls, but because they are good at being girls. To be female is to be not male. And despite feminism's challenges to the dominant cultural script of females as vigilant guardians of virginity and to the practice of stigmatizing female desire, the cultural script of male sexual desire remains essentially the same. It is still constructed as predatory and dangerous. Brad Perry argues that males are socialized to view their sexuality as characterized by action, control, and achievement, and to view sex as the get-some game." End quote. What we must come to understand from this is that if to be female is to be not male in a certain sense, then we can in turn refine this through the context provided. Oppression is a vector with direction and magnitude. Two things being constructed in binary opposition does not make discrimination a game of picking one's favorite of the two, but rather discrimination becomes a downhill slide from one into the other. The slide hurts everybody, but it still imposes a hierarchy of sorts. Oppression is not a wall between the two social substances, but is in fact the box that constructs the borders of negation. as oppression and hierarchy. The negation box, or for those with a nose for sniffing out inspirations, this is more properly Taiki Kubo's Caja Negación in his popular work Bleach, fittingly known for its powerful visuals of black and white contrast. The Caja Negación is an imposition of sovereignty, an assertion of superiority, and active aggression, and all of these stand among the necessary traits of oppression in this context, assuming uniformly sinister connotations for all of those words. Anyway, the negation box restricts one more than the other, but the free, air quotes free, party cannot move far as the two parties are fundamentally linked, such as the black and the white, the disabled and the abled, the female and the male. Aragorn holds power and virtue in his resistance to sexuality, but that's an inherently masculine power. Blade has a similar resistance. The etymology of vampire shows the word to have its roots in concepts of sexuality, and what defines Blade's struggle, if not his resistance to vampirism. Not only does he slay vampires, cutting perhaps a bit too close an allegory to sexual violence perhaps, but he also uses a serum to hold off his own thirst for blood. The previously alluded to potential love interest asks Blade during the course of Blade 2, "Why do you do that?" She questions why he fights what she considers to be both his and her nature. She is also a person of color and master swordswoman, and therefore stands eye to eye with Blade. There's no part of his commentary she doesn't mirror, except that she was born a vampire. While the same is half true for him, his mother was assaulted, and this complicates the matter. But in a larger way, this romantic counterpart suggests that Blade has alternatives. He is making a choice, and in a certain sense he is defying his air quotes nature around her. Just as Arwen's presence in Aragorn's life is a necessary part of maintaining this kind of non-sexuality, so too does Blade encounter similar situations with women in his stories, but they are no detriment to this view on his character. This makes him hugely appealing as a candidate for the American superhero myth, and his choices in the narrative factor into this heavily. The longest answer. This is no snag. This is something that helps to define Blade. In the end, when Nomak infects her and Blade kills Nomak, Blade carries her outside by her own request, so that she will die before she becomes infected with the Reaper strain of vampirism, and loses all sense of her former identity. She says, "I want to see the sun," and Blade obliges, for the sun is no danger to him. She burns and falls to ashes in his arms, and he cradles her corpse gently in the end. For all Blade's appearance as a hyper-masculine war machine, he exudes a certain compassion in this scene that he lacks in almost all other scenes. He's almost always decisive and purposeful, but here he's simply allowing someone who he cared about, someone whose life he had previously saved, to pass out of his life. There's a sadness and a trauma to the scene. It's a bittersweet victory where Blade has once again killed every vampire in his way to save humanity. If only he may find himself thinking he hadn't needed to. This is the weakness of his character. He's strong, but despite friendships and even a father-son relationship with his mentor, he is always on some level alone. Maybe that's a part of why Blade wields the single sword he keeps in a sheath on his back. Maybe it's even a part of why he's necessarily the way that he is in terms of his identity. Those features may empower him some of the time, but they also offer a window into his greatest tragedy as a character. He's alone. The sword is just one tall singular monolith, and the man himself fades into his black clothing in the dead of night. He is alone, and he belongs nowhere. He is the wanderer and the stranger, a warrior but by necessity never a lover. The tragedy of his story is not that he loses the fight, he never does, but that he fights it all. That is to say that Blade is a surprisingly tragic character and concept, especially in this age of comics and film. In his YouTube video analysis of The Killing Joke, a 2016 animation based on the original Alan Moore Batman comic, the YouTuber Hbomberguy concludes by saying, quote, "While it could be dismissed as garbage to be left by the wayside, what makes it worth looking at is how emblematic it is of all of these wider problems. Incidentally, it's the ultimate modern demonstration of the problem with comics." What Hbomberguy refers to with this statement is what he discusses throughout the video. Commodification is especially harmful to the comics industry because it spawns works like the film The Killing Joke, which is, under his analysis, a poorly thought-out reproduction of a comic that had so much to say. The film lacks these many subtleties in itself because it ignores how they are represented. Lighting, for example, lighting in the comic that highlights critical scenes vanishes, lost in film translation, destroying the commentary of a scene. The reason for that is that, quote, these kinds of creators read Watchmen, read The Dark Knight Returns, read The Killing Joke, works that presented characters as flawed but real, and used even desks as characterization and world-building, works that had, to put it in one word, ideas. But these creators didn't see that stuff when they read those comics. They saw the darkness, the edginess, the grittiness that appeared on the surface, and tried desperately to recreate that. The appearance of depth mattered more than the real stuff, end quote. In this case, the real stuff is undeniably that content which moves a work from being a metaphorical, pretty light show to being a work that has something to say. If one has ever felt the sneaking suspicion that critics condemn all work with violent explosions a little too eagerly, but has also felt that filmmakers are not quite critical enough of their need to introduce violent explosions, this begins to feel eerily familiar. There's a subtle way in which the Blade films toe a dangerous line, treading into a place where Blade's ability to win fights matters more than how Blade feels, or all the other critical elements that, as this essay has hopefully shown, make up essential and sometimes even controversial elements of his character. But just as Blade the character is a fit for the American superhero myth, it is also true that Blade, the movie franchise, fantastically represents how the currently popular genre of comic book hero films has a tendency to destroy essential depth and meaning. The first Blade film is a story not simply of revenge, but also of protection. It's standard hero fare, but it's complicated with the involvement of a woman of color who teams up with Blade in order to assist Blade in defeating his nemesis, the man who made Blade who he is and also took everything from him. It's a story that deviates just the barest hint from the trite cliches that drive portions of it, as the sidekick in question effectively represents Blade's conflict with the death of his mother and his obligation to humanity, his own and others. Blade 2 has similar bends to it, as it chronicles not only human betrayals of Blade on a more personal level than before seen, but also Blade's struggle against other characters that show perverted mirrors of him. A black vampire who doesn't resist the thirst, a vampire mutation who uses his mutant powers to hurt humans, and a racist sunglasses-wearing vampire in black who aggressively challenges Blade's authority. Blade Trinity, however, has few complications, and is every bit the representation of the death of comic hero films as it was the literal end of the Blade films. Blade's face-off with Dracula is more or less just a whitened film with less to say. The struggle between Blade and Dracula is more or less standard fare for these kinds of movies, so Blade Trinity makes of itself a weak Blade film. It's not that the film is exclusively bad, it's just that it's comparably lacking in the important ideas, the ideas that matter. It is my private suspicion that, when watching an action film, and this includes the aforementioned comic book hero films, the fact that a single line of dialogue can throw us with its depth or surprise us with its powerful meaning is somehow telling to the quality of the overall experience. Of course, a brief but meaningful moment jars us, as the general experience is so lacking in meaning with that level of staying power. It pours further salt in this open wound that movie trailers so often spoil these little emotional moments in favor of advertising a film that is mostly devoid of them. The ultimate and final irony is that this essay has concerned itself with Blade's appearance as it forms his identity, but now must admit that a reconstruction of an element of that appearance does not reconstruct that identity. Even if the identity of Blade were broken into all isolated pieces and put back together again, that character would not be Blade. They would only be playing at imitating Blade. Blade has existed, he's been formed, he has a signature in time. This is the importance of the opening comments in this essay as well. Artists have an obligation to move forward and build new constructs out of old ones. To borrow pieces is no crime, but to use those pieces only to remake the work of older artists is a dishonorable abuse of one's position. Further, it is clear that those artists who are concerned with attempting such an act so grievously misunderstand the work that they seek to emulate that they are not capable of even replicating it. This is the equivalent of putting sunglasses on a drawing of a black man, handing him a sword, and calling him Knife, an act which may sound ridiculous but is also a tried-and-true staple of the comics industry. If there's a better way to summarize what this essay is all about, it could only be that it's about Blade. Not a franchise, but the character. It's about the real Blade. Because beneath the image of the man there is an idea, and it is an idea that constructs him. As mentioned before, Blade doesn't just kill vampires, Blade responds to vampires. Whatever might be said of comics as an industry, or of Blade Trinity, or of any of the other primary or secondary elements that construct this character, the nature of this response is the core of Blade. Cut into the skin, and this is the lifeblood that flows out.